What is up, you guys? This is JP Fitness, and in this video we are going to be talking about slow tempos versus fast tempos. So piggybacking off my last video where I was talking about one tip that I can give you guys is to, control your repetitions, control your weights, and not rush the set. It kind of, segues into this topic, and that's slower tempos versus faster tempos on lifting. So you, depending on your goal, if you're someone who's more strength oriented, you probably just did whatever tempo felt good for you or whatever tempo helped you lift the most weight. You probably didn't even think about tempo. Now, if you're someone whose goal is not strength and it's more hypertrophy based or gaining muscle, then you're someone who maybe most likely probably aimed more towards slower tempos or just didn't kind of rush the set that you were doing because you wanted to gain more muscle. Now, this is kind of, I don't want to say it's a hot topic because from the people that I've heard talk about it or people who are usually on one side of the fence, you have the evidence-based side where it's kind of, you can almost sum up their answer to say like, it doesn't really matter, just lift the weight. As long as you're not lifting to extremes, then that's pretty much all that matters, which again, for the most part, I agree. There's a little bit more to it, which we're gonna flesh out in a bit, but that's pretty much what I agree with. So that's kind of like the TLDR version of it, is just lift to whatever feels normal for you. But for those of you who are not on the evidence-based side, and again, by evidence, I guess it's both evidence-based, because the people who are getting evidence from their anecdotal experiences, it's still evidence. So when I mean by evidence-based, I mean the people going mainly off of studies, and then I think people who are going off of more practical experience, or maybe kind of more old school in their approach of thinking when it comes to tempo. So on that end, you have people who, who they don't think, okay, well, it doesn't matter, just lift however you want. They tend to be, okay, you want to lift a little bit more slow, controlled, especially if they're talking about hypertrophy. And that tends to be the more old school kind of bodybuilding type of mentality. So obviously, one thing that I like approaching when it comes to a topic is not having a very dogmatic or a black and white point of view. That's one of the kind of worst mindsets you can go into in fitness, or when trying to kind of solve something for your program or you're trying to get results. The reason being is because there are very few black and whites in fitness. When you're trying to solve an issue, there's almost always a situation for something, even if it doesn't initially sound like it. So when it comes to faster tempos, some things that you can gain or benefit from faster tempos. One, for strength, by faster tempos, I mean the eccentric and concentric, so both. So my last video, I talked about how you don't want to rush a set, but at the same time, if you're an advanced lifter and your main goal is strength, when you are doing a set, sometimes you don't want to go too slow on the eccentric portion of the lift. If you can comfortably control a load on the eccentric and go a little faster, you might want to do that. Again, I don't say that in the expense of your form. So you don't want to just drop down in the hole on a squat or whatever exercise it is, a dumbbell, bench press, incline press. You don't want to just drop down real quick and come out of the hole like that, because it can mess up form. But if you feel you can control it, going a little bit faster on the eccentric can help you come out of the hole a little bit faster, because you're taking advantage of the stretch reflex from the stretch shortening cycle. So again, that in turn can help you lift more weight. So certain circumstances, lifting fast or going faster on the negative can help you for strength. Also for strength is when you go fast on the concentric portion. Again, this isn't a black and white, but there's very strong evidence, and I would almost always recommend that an individual lift faster on the concentric portion of the lift, because you have to apply more force into a load. If you want to lift it faster, then you lift it at a slower speed. And again, the evidence is pretty strong for this, that when you lift faster on the concentric portion of the lift, you get more strength gains over the long term. So that's definitely something I would recommend in regard to lifting fast. So again, the main caveat for that is you don't want it to be, at the expense of your form. If someone's gonna take this and run away with it and say, oh, he said, go really fast on the way down or really fast on the way up, that's not entirely true. You wanna go as fast as you can on the negative. That's within your control. So that might be slower for some or slower for others. So that's for fast tempos. For slow tempos, for strength, there are benefits to that as well. For example, if you take someone who's squatting and they tend to have their hips rise when coming out of the hole, or they have some issue with their form, it could be in any exercise. Again, a dumbbell press is another example. It could be any exercise that you want, but if you tend to have technique errors, it's good to have some sets dedicated to technique work and to slow things down so that maybe later on you can pick the speeds back up and take advantage of the stretch reflex from the stretch shortening cycle. But again, that's one of the best things you can do if you're having technique errors, is just go slower. If you go slower and you lighten the load a little bit, you could say, okay, what's going on here? You can record yourself and see at what point do you tend to have these faults in your form, or what point do your hips rise in a squat versus do they not rise and the bar moves at the same time. So you can kind of look at it like that. So again, going slow tempo or slower tempos is good for strength in fixing your technique. So that's one area that I would think about it going slow being better. Now, another benefit to going slow versus going fast is if you're a power lifter and you're competing, or you're competing in any sport where they're kind of looking at depth, it's just a fact of humans, is that, for example, when you're powerlifting, you have a judge on each side of you and you have to meet a certain depth level for the squat. Let's just say you're someone who does like going fast in the hole because you're good at it and you take advantage of it, like I mentioned previously. But you have someone who's watching your form, and let's just say you're right on the line of whether or not that's a good rep or a bad rep, you get a white light or a red light, then going slower is probably gonna be better in the sense of you might not get a red light. If the human eye is just seeing someone go drop down real fast in a squat, come back up, if they can't tell, they might just give you a red light versus giving you a white light. So in regards to form or meeting depth, that's also a pro to someone slower when everything else is held equal, is that you might have less human error when it comes to judging a lift. And since, again, a lot of you might not compete in some strength sport, but that's something that I have to point out. So again, as you can tell, there are times and places where you might want to go a little bit faster or slower in regards to strength. Now, in regards to hypertrophy, this is one where it's a little bit more controversial. And this is where I kind of have my opinion of, in general, you should just kind of lift however you feel like you want to lift. And then that'll kind of take care of itself. But for the people who are advocates for lifting real slow or lifting with a really slow tempo. Let's just say they have like a 3-second, 4 or 5-second negative and they go fast on the way up. I've talked about this in previous videos. If you feel like you are lifting so slow to the point where you have to lighten the load on yourself versus if you had a more moderate tempo and you could lift a little bit heavier loads, you need to be careful of that, because there is evidence that shows that, there's evidence for it, and theoretically it makes sense too, is that, again, volume has a dose response relationship with hypertrophy to an extent. So if you're such a big advocate of going slow or having slow tempos, but again, the absolute intensity of the lift is taking a hit, because you have to, it's a give and take. It's like a seesaw kind of. The heavier you go, the less slow you can be during a lift when everything else is held equal, and the faster you lift, in a sense, the heavier you can go. So it's kind of like a back and forth there. So for hypertrophy, I don't think you should lift so slow that your load is taking a hit. So anywhere from a 1 to a 3-second negative is typically safe. If you're going longer than a 3-second negative and you don't have a specific purpose for it, you might be hurting yourself or shooting yourself in the foot in the long run in regards to gains. Now, there are other benefits to lifting slow though compared to lifting fast as well. Is if you're lifting slow, one thing that I've noticed is that when it comes to specific exercises that take too much advantage of the stretch shortening cycle or the stretch reflex, like I mentioned earlier, where it was a benefit, you might not be directing a lot of that load onto the muscle that you're trying to work. And a big one here is calf work. If you're doing calf races and you tend to kind of drop real fast on the eccentric and bounce off the bottom, going way too fast on the way down and taking too much advantage of the stretch reflex there, then you're taking a lot of load off that muscle that's being worked. So in certain circumstances like calves or arm exercises, if you drop too fast or you go too fast, again, you don't want to take the load off the muscle being worked. You're trying to target that muscle, you're trying to recruit those motor units, you're trying to apply mechanical tension to them so you can grow in the long term. So in that sense, I would be very wary of going too fast on a lift, since your main goal isn't strength at that point. Numbers aren't necessarily the ultimate goal, whereas they are important, but they're not the ultimate goal. So in that sense, I would say that lifting slower is better. So it's a seesaw there as well. You don't want to go so slow on tempos that you're sacrificing load, but you don't want to go so fast that your ligaments and tendons are being recruited into the lift as much as possible. One more note about hypertrophy and tempo is on the way up. This is kind of where it's more, in my opinion, is very like what you prefer. Now for me, even for hypertrophy, I still like lifting fast on the concentric because of the benefits that I'm probably maybe getting on strength, even though it's not strength oriented and I'm just used to it. I like lifting fast in the concentric portion of the lift on the way up. Now, I honestly don't think it's bad, especially for hypertrophy, to go a little bit slower on the way up, but I would be very wary of that, just like the negative too. You don't want to go too slow on the way up. Again, like anything in fitness, it's not really a black and white. You need to look at why you're implementing whatever you're doing and how it's going to benefit you reach your goals. If you're just implementing anything at any time and you don't know why, that's where you might run into some trouble. If you guys have any questions, comments, leave them down below. I'll see you guys in the next time. Peace.